LiberalViewer presents.
So, welcome to LiberalViewer Sunday Live Clip Roundup. Thanks for joining me. I've picked out almost 40 of the weekend's best clips for you tonight, and as usual, they come mostly from the Sunday morning news analysis shows on the Big Five corporate outlets of ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, and Fox News, the corporate media here in the United States. Plus, I'll have about a half dozen clips from Friday night's Real Time with Bill Maher on HBO, and a couple more from Weekend Update on last night's Saturday Night Live. I put the clips into the several topics you can see listed down in the video description, and if you're watching this as a recorded show, as usual, you should see those time indexes down there to skip to the topics that interest you, including more clips on Islam and the ongoing debate about whether terrorist attacks by Islamic extremists should be blamed on Islam or extremism, then several more clips on the topic of free speech raised by the attack on the Charlie Hebdo satirical magazine, plus a bunch more clips on the continuing threat from terrorism, including from Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and even Boko Haram this week. I'll have one clip on the continuing conflict in Ukraine, and a few more clips at the end previewing President Barack Obama's State of the Union speech that's coming up on Tuesday. But first I want to cover the issue of gay marriage, starting with a joke from last night's Saturday Night Live on the Supreme Court's announcement it may finally decide the issue of marriage equality, which Colin Jost covered on Weekend Update, like this.
The Supreme Court announced that in June, they will decide once and for all whether same-sex marriage is constitutional, which leaves opponents just 6 months to break in, steal the Constitution, and change it to "We the people, no homo."
Now, that might seem like a joke, but over on Fox News Sunday, I noticed the guest anchor Shannon Bream kind of framed the marriage equality issue with a little bit of bias by asking what the Constitution does say, if anything, about the right to same-sex marriage. So I guess they kind of were trying to say that it didn't say pro-homo in the Constitution. And I guess the way they introduced it kind of made some sense, given that Shannon Bream also introduced the two-sided discussion where both sides are, as often occurs on Fox News, Republicans. So here you can see that introduction from Shannon Bream on Fox News Sunday this morning in this clip.
The Supreme Court announced Friday it will take up same-sex marriage cases from 4 states in a decision that could ultimately bring legal same-sex marriage to all 50 states. As our highest court prepares to rule on this divisive issue, we want to discuss what the Constitution says, if anything, about the right to same-sex marriage with 2 top advocates. Leading conservative lawyer Ted Olsen, who scored a big victory at the Supreme Court for same-sex couples looking to marry in California, and Tony Perkins, president of the Family Research Council. Gentlemen, welcome.
Now, I had criticized Shannon Bream there for asking what the Constitution says, if anything, about the right to same-sex marriage, because that's framing the question the wrong way. The Constitution talks about the right to liberty and due process, which includes a right to privacy and a fundamental right to marry that I'll get to in a little bit. But it also talks about every person getting equal protection of the law, even if it doesn't say anything specifically about same-sex marriage. And on the topic of how to frame the question, Shannon Bream also seemed particularly fixated on that issue in her first question to the conservative but pro-marriage equality attorney Ted Olsen over in this clip.
When the Supreme Court takes a case, they set up the specific questions they want the advocates to answer. So I want to read those and then get your reaction. These are the 2 questions they've posed. Does the 14th Amendment require a state to license a marriage between 2 people of the same sex? The second question, does the 14th Amendment require a state to recognize a marriage between 2 people of the same sex when their marriage was lawfully licensed and performed out of state? Ted, very specific phrasing. What does it say to you about how they're going to tackle this case?
Well, the reason that those 2 questions were asked by the Supreme Court is because those were the issues in the states from which the 4 states was Kentucky, Michigan, Tennessee, and Ohio. Those cases came up to the court from those states. Some of those states prohibited recognition of marriages that were lawful in other states. Some of them prohibited marriage between anyone other than a man and a woman. So those were the 2 basic questions the court was presented with. And it wanted to make it clear, it wanted to hear from the litigants as to those 2 questions and not a lot of other stuff.
But the phrasing in that first question, does that stand out to you, saying, does the 14th Amendment require a state to license a marriage, versus saying, does the 14th Amendment give couples, same-sex couples, the right to marry? I mean, it's a bit of a nuance, but it kind of was a red flag for some of us who watched this stuff.
Well, I didn't put too much weight on that, because the issues that have come up there's 4 other federal appeals courts that have decided that states can't prohibit marriage between persons of the same sex. And it gets involved in whether states are engaged in the marriage business by providing licenses and then providing laws that give benefits to people that are married. I wouldn't put too much significance on the way the question was phrased.
Yeah, and they've normally a case gets an hour. They're giving 2.5 hours to this one, so it'll be interesting. All right, Tony, I want.
So yeah, you can see Shannon Bream there is like really fixated on the way the questions were framed, when it doesn't really make that much difference, as the very seasoned Supreme Court litigator Ted Olsen tried to explain to her, and she kind of wouldn't let go of that. And she seemed to ask a somewhat confrontational question to the other guest, Tony Perkins, who's this right-wing religious guy from the American Family Association, is that his, or Focus on the Family, is that his group? I can never remember the names of all those right-wing conservative groups, but he is one of the right-wing religious Republican conservative guys, and so he was taking the anti-marriage equality position. And here Shannon Bream asks him what seems to be a confrontational question about, what about the 36 states where it's now legal for same-sex couples to get married? But you can see by the end she's kind of agreeing with his response and his rebuttal to that over in this clip.
All right, Tony, I want to look at where same-sex marriage is now legal across the country. 36 states and here in the District of Columbia. More than 70% of Americans now live in places where same-sex marriage is legal. Have you lost the fight?
Well, keep in mind, Shannon, that only 3 states have the voters actually voted. 2/3 of the states, people live in states where the voters or the legislatures have affirmed the natural definition of marriage. So we're hopeful that the court will side with the American people on this, the majority of voters who have been very clear in the last 2 decades that marriage is a union of a man and a woman, and that they'll side with the American voters and not with a handful of judges. I mean, most people don't want lawyers and judges running the country.
But sadly, they do in many cases. No offense. All right, let's.
It seemed kind of like a gratuitous editorial comment from the Fox News anchor Shannon Bream there. But I want to actually show one more clip from that whole interchange. And I'm not showing the entire exchange or the entire argument, but I think Ted Olsen, the conservative pro-marriage equality lawyer, got a lot better, made a lot more points than this right-wing religious guy, Tony Perkins. And here's just one sample of their interchange where Tony Perkins tries to claim that there isn't a fundamental right to marriage, which is, anyone who's read the cases knows that's not true, and he gets kind of slapped down by Ted Olsen on that issue over in this clip.
But the difference here is that this is not recognized as a fundamental right. This is not deeply rooted in our history. We're talking about something that's unprecedented. In less than 2 decades, we've had state after state go to the polls and people express themselves. This is not how we reach broad social consensus over major issues like this. I mean, as evidenced by what's going to take place here this week, the 42nd anniversary of Roe v. Wade. The court said it was going to decide this issue in 1973. It has not. It will not decide this issue if it imposes a one-size-fits-all scheme of marriage on the American people.
I want to say one thing about that. The United States Supreme Court 15 times over the last 120 years has said that marriage is a fundamental right. It involves
but not same-sex marriage.
It never once in any of those cases did it say that it had to be between a man and a woman. 15 times it said it was a matter of privacy, liberty, association, dignity, and respect for the individual. That's what the Constitution
Well, Ted, let me ask you about this Roe v. Wade.
So like I said, there's more to that argument, and Ted Olsen pretty much beats up on Tony Perkins. And so if you want to watch all of Fox News Sunday, I put a link down to that program as well as all the other programs I'm taking clips from where the video is available online. But before I leave the issue of marriage equality, I want to show one more clip from HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher. This is from the overtime segment that they do after the regular broadcast, and they put the entire overtime segment up on YouTube for free, so there's another link down to that. So this is something you can also see for free on YouTube. this is where Bill Maher addressed what the Supreme Court did. And then there's actually a more interesting comment from Josh Borro, this MSNBC business correspondent, and I'll talk about that a little more if you see it here.
Now that the Supreme Court has decided to rule on gay marriage in all 50 states, are we entering the final frontier in gay rights? Well, 36 states already have it. I mean, talk about leading from behind. I don't even try.
I think the final frontier in gay rights is inside people's homes and communities. I mean, gay marriage is great for sort of, affluent gays on the coasts who are, it's good for everybody, but I think it's a key concern among people who sort of don't face a ton of discrimination in their daily lives. And the last thing is like dealing with official state discrimination. I think you have a lot of kids growing up in religious households in the South where it's, they have official equality and that will percolate down into individual attitudes. But, they're still facing discrimination from their families and their churches and people in their workplaces. And so I think it's going to be less of a policy issue, but there's still a lot of mind changing that has to be done that for a lot of ordinary people is actually really more important than the public.
So I thought that was an interesting point that even though some people are framing this as the final frontier, that this is the ultimate right, the marriage equality, the state recognition of same-sex couples, that there is going to continue to be a lot of discrimination in a lot of places, especially, not the big cities. And so there will still be a lot of work to fight discrimination against, LGBT, and all sorts of stuff is still going to be going on, even if the Supreme Court decides, as most people seem to think, that there is a fundamental right to marriage equality and it'll be legal in all 50 states. But I don't know, there'll be some more analysis of that as the oral arguments are in April, and the decision should probably come down sometime in June, and hopefully I'll get a chance to address that issue in more detail. But I do want to now go to several topics having to do with terrorism and Islam and free speech. First, several I have just on the topic of the Islam controversy and whether Islamic extremism should be blamed on Islam or extremism. And it kind of ties in with free speech. It's kind of both topics together, but I'm going to start with the more Islam angle. This is from HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher on Friday night. Bill Maher making a joke in his monologue about something that happened in Saudi Arabia recently, which I'll talk about after you see it here.
Meanwhile, over in Saudi Arabia, they have delayed the next public flogging. Do you hear about this? There was a blogger. A blogger got flogged. Say that 3 times fast. For insulting Islam, and he gets 1,000 lashes. That's the penalty. And of course, you can't do that all at once. So they gave him 50. He's supposed to get 50 a week, but they found out he still has not recovered from the first 50, so they delayed the next 50. See, there are moderate Muslims.
Now that's kind of funny, but I don't think the moderate Muslims are the people who delay lashings in Saudi Arabia. I think there are a lot of moderate Muslims that actually are moderate. So even though it's a funny joke, the premise isn't really that accurate. And speaking of accuracy, I showed that clip last week about the so-called terrorism expert on that Fox News program claiming that that non-Muslims weren't allowed to go into Birmingham in the United Kingdom, and Bill Maher also addressed that issue as part of his ongoing addressing of the Islam controversy. This was back in his in the discussion part of the program over in this clip.
Yeah.
Let's go to England for a second. Now, there was a controversy this week. Fox News, they had somebody, one of their commentators, Stephen Emerson. He said Birmingham, England is all Muslim. Turned out to be a lie. Lies don't help. But Birmingham, England is 25% Muslim. Okay. They've had people in their schools start teaching Islamic teachings, Islamic teachers in schools where there was a lot of Muslim kids. They praised Anwar al-Awlaki, who inspired lots of terrorist activities. We took them out with a drone. They've had a teacher tell students that it is wrong for the wife to ever refuse sex to the husband because that's Islamic teaching. What I'm saying is that sometimes in a melting pot, people don't melt. And, 10% of France is Muslim. I think 10% of Holland is Muslim. And I think they're having more children than non-Muslims. When you get to 25% of the population, things do change. A fervid minority, we've seen this in our country, can change things a lot more than a placid majority. So, I don't want to live in a world where we can't wear a miniskirt walking down the street,
Now, there was a kind of sleight of hand there in what Bill Maher said. First, he said that France was 10% Muslim, and I've seen it ranging from 5 to 10%. But also, when you look at the percentage of a place that is Muslim, that doesn't necessarily mean that all those people want to institute Sharia law. I mean, there are moderate Muslims who don't want to impose their religion on other people or their standards of decency. And I mean, I think that Islam is not the only religion that has people who want to impose standards on others based on their personal religious beliefs. And it's also not the only religion where there are believers in the religion who don't want to do that. And to say that there's a certain percentage, 25% of a city, means that there's this vocal minority who's imposing Islam on non-Muslims and stopping people from wearing miniskirts. I mean, I don't think that necessarily follows in the argument. But I did notice that over on CNN State of the Union, there was a guest host this week, Jim Sciutto, and he asked a whole bunch of really good questions. And a couple of the ones he asked were on this issue that Bill Maher brought up about our Muslim allies not really respecting the liberties that we respect, and specifically mentioning the flogging of the blogger in Saudi Arabia, plus a woman in Pakistan who was sentenced for blasphemy for being Christian. And anyway, Jim Sciutto asked that of the two senators he had on. The first clip is Richard Burr, who is the new Republican chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, over in this clip.
The administration has argued that as important as intelligence steps and military steps to fight terrorism, it's important to attack the ideology. And yet last week, we noticed that in Saudi Arabia, a close U.S. ally, that a blogger flogged, sentenced to 1,000 lashes simply for starting a debate online on his blog about extremism in his country. At the same time, Pakistan, of course, another close U.S. ally, has sentenced to death a Christian woman for blasphemy as well. These are close allies. Is it your view that these countries, Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, through steps like this, are, in effect, encouraging terrorism by helping to feed the ideology behind it?
Well, Jim, let me say, a week ago I said this was a fight, a war against Western civilization. And what I realized was my mistake in that sentence was that this is every bit the fear and the threat of average Muslims in Muslim countries around the world. This is a concern and a threat to us, to Europe, and to every Muslim around the world that's not a fanatic terrorist. And the reality is that we've got to reach out to those individuals because we should be as concerned about making sure that the world is safe for them as we do for our own children.
But are our allies doing enough as well? Because a country such as Saudi Arabia has enormous influence, Pakistan as well, against this sort of extremism. Are they doing their part, or in effect, are they making the problem worse?
Well, Jim, as you know, they've been a contributor to the funding since Al-Qaeda was created. A lot of the Middle Eastern countries have. And hopefully our administration is reaching out to them, as is the global community, and saying, things have to stop. You have to quit funding terrorism. You have to quit teaching this to your youth. We've got to make sure that we're after the same future that they are. And I dare say that if they're not willing to help us in that partnership, then there ought to be some type of ramifications from it.
Now, that almost seemed like the Republican chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee was taking a page out of Jimmy Carter's presidency and saying that you have to respect human rights in order to get U.S. aid, that's like important in American foreign policy, which hasn't usually been true in places like Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. And I actually would like to see the United States have more of a human rights component in who it gives aid to, and to consider whether they uphold the liberal values that we uphold. And that's also something you heard from the Democratic senator who was also on State of the Union when Jim Sciutto asked him that same question, basically. This is Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut over in this clip.
We were just speaking with the Republican Senate Intelligence Chair Richard Burr, and he made a point at the end of our conversation, which I thought was very powerful. I was asking him about, during the week of the Paris attacks, you have two close U.S. allies, Saudi Arabia, flogging a blogger for just sparking a debate online about extremism. You have Pakistan, another close ally, sentencing a Christian for blasphemy. And I asked him if our close allies here are doing enough to fight extremism, and he said in these cases, no, they're not. And that if that holds true, that there should be consequences. I wonder if you agree with him.
I do agree with him. And, the reality is just as Richard said, this is not a war between Christianity and Islam, between the East and the West. And I think he was very right to point that out. But when you have these kind of actions inside Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, it perpetuates this myth that that is indeed the fight that's going on. And, of course, we know that for years, for decades, the Saudis have been funneling money to Wahhabi clerical organizations that fund the very madrasas that train Islamic jihadists. We certainly know in Pakistan that at the same time that they've been fighting radical elements, they've also been funding those radical elements, or at least being permissive of them. So we've got to have some hard conversations with our allies in the coming weeks and days. We've let it go on for far too long. And now that we realize the reality, the danger, the immediacy of this threat to the United States and to our allies, I think Republicans and Democrats can come together and say, listen, time is up. We need to see some progress, or especially with a country like Pakistan that's the recipient of major dollars from the United States, there's going to be some consequences.
So that's bipartisan agreement there, that there's going to be consequences for countries like Pakistan if they aren't upholding more liberal values, which, that's nice to hear. Hopefully it would actually translate into U.S. foreign policy, which I'm not sure it actually will, but I wanted to show you those two clips from CNN State of the Union. And as I'm transitioning more into the free speech aspect here, I want to show a quote from HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher again. This is Bill Maher in his new rules at the end. This is one of the two clips I'm going to show where he's talking about people who don't understand what free speech means, and he attacks Glenn Greenwald, of all people, based on an article that Glenn Greenwald wrote in recently that I put a link down to it in the video description. You can read the article yourself, but first here's Bill Maher's commentary attacking Glenn Greenwald, quoting him a little bit out of context over in this clip.
Glenn Greenwald says anti-Muslim speech, like the cartoons in Charlie, are a, quote, vital driver in bombing and occupying Muslim countries and killing the innocent. Really? Newspaper cartoons did all that? Wait till they get to the horoscopes and the crossword. It reminds me of one of the protest signs I saw up at Berkeley last month. It said, Islamophobia kills. Does it? The phobia kills? Or maybe more it's the AK-47s and the beheadings and the planes into buildings. Anyway, wow. Really? You don't agree with that? Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Hey, one guy, thank you.
And sorry, I don't really agree with that criticism from Bill Maher. I'm actually going to show a clip from later in that new rule that I do agree with. But what Glenn Greenwald was saying, well, first, in his article, if you click on that link I put down in the video description, you'll see he actually reprinted a whole bunch of controversial cartoons. But he's saying not that the cartoons are responsible for all these problems, but that Islamophobia and the dehumanizing of Muslims and the villainization of Muslims is one of the tactics used to support these wars in the Middle East, which isn't something that Bill Maher addressed at all. Here's a couple paragraphs from that Glenn Greenwald article. You can see he says, in the West, in particular, the West has spent years bombing, invading, and occupying Muslim countries and killing, torturing, and lawlessly imprisoning innocent Muslims, and anti-Muslim speech has been a vital driver in sustaining support for those policies. So he's not saying that the cartoons are a vital driver of violence when it's really violence on the part of the Muslims that we should be worried about, which was Bill Maher's kind of straw man argument there. What he's really saying is that the West has demonized Muslims as part of its ongoing war against Muslims in the Middle East to make it easier to attack them. It's demonized them, and that these kind of caricatures of Muslims, like in Charlie Hebdo, Glenn Greenwald is saying in his article, he supports free speech and he supports their right to say what they want to say and to be free of violent repercussions. He's not blaming them for their own, deaths and murder or whatever, but he's just saying in that part of the article that the demonization of Muslims is partly responsible for the ongoing war in Muslim countries, making it easier for that to happen. And speaking of this whole Islam controversy, I've been promising this book about the Sam Harris end of faith quote and his conflict with Glenn Greenwald and whether Sam Harris is Islamophobic. Well, that's in final production, and I'm announcing here the final release date. The upcoming video titled Sam Harris Defamed as Islamophobic by Glenn Greenwald, Reza Eslan. It will be released in draft form for my Patreon patrons to give me some feedback on Tuesday, January 20th. And then after that, I will put up a final version for release to the public, probably before noon Pacific time on Thursday, January 22nd. So for anyone who's been waiting for that video, that's the actual release date. Oh, and if you want to join my 10 patrons that I currently have and help me continue making videos despite the problems I'm having with the revenue I used to get from YouTube, then click down in the video description to support me and support my videos on Patreon. I'd really appreciate that. Now, another part of this free speech controversy and with Charlie Hebdo has been some comments by Pope Francis where some people say he was saying you can't insult religion, and then, I don't know, I have only seen the translation, but first I want to show how Michael Che joked about this on Saturday Night Live last night. This is the other clip from Weekend Update that you can see here.
Pope Francis this week criticized the magazine Charlie Hebdo by saying you can't make a toy out of religions. And then he put on his giant hat, grabbed his wand, and went back to his golden castle.
So that's the ridicule of the Pope's statement. Now, I actually want to show a commentary from Bob Schieffer on CBS's Face the Nation, who I've criticized a lot about some of his pro-war sentiments and also pro-spying sentiments. But I want to show him give actually a fairly good analysis of what I'm hoping Pope Francis was saying, which is kind of what Glenn Greenwald was saying about the difference between what you have a right to say under free speech and what is right for you to say, and they're not necessarily the same things, which Bob Schieffer talked about over in this clip.
I'm not a Catholic, and only God knows if I even qualify as a religious person, but I like the new Pope. He reminds us that religion is about kindness, not imposing our will on others. So in the wake of the Paris tragedy, when he told us that free speech has limits and that we should not make fun of the religions of others, I listened. There is no stronger defender of the First Amendment than me. As a reporter, I stand second to no one in defending the French magazine's right to print their satirical cartoons. Certainly, though, they did not deserve to die. But defending the magazine's right to print the cartoons is different than approving the cartoons. Long ago, our Supreme Court ruled free speech is not a license to put public safety at risk by shouting fire in a crowded theater. And good taste and sensitivity to the feelings of others dictates self-imposed limits on what we say every day. That, too, is a principle of civilized society. I think what the Pope was saying was there is a difference in having the right to do something and doing the right thing. I'm glad he reminded us. That, too, should be a part of this conversation.
Now, a lot of that I agree with, especially the part where I support the right of free speech of groups and opinions that I don't support the content of their speech. And so, just because I support someone's free speech, like the Nazis' right to march in Skokie, Illinois, where there are a bunch of Holocaust survivors lived, or the right of Holocaust deniers in Europe. I guess in France and Germany you can't deny the Holocaust, and I don't think that should be illegal. And I personally wrote a brief in favor of the KKK's right to free speech on a government radio station, and that doesn't mean that I'm gonna start wearing a button that says "Je suis KKK," even though I support their right to free speech. That doesn't mean that it's speech that I condone or like or even want to help distribute. So I think that's kind of something, a distinction that Bob Schieffer was drawing there. Now, the whole thing about yelling fire in a crowded theater, or there's also something called fighting words. I've always thought the fighting words doctrine under the First Amendment that says that your speech can be restricted if someone hearing it could get so upset by it that they'll start hitting you or whatever, that I think that goes too far, and that was never really a good Supreme Court doctrine, because it gives the listener a veto power over what's offensive. And so I don't think that's a really good doctrine, but that is kind of the part of what Pope Francis was saying that I disagree with. And I want to show a really interesting response to that from the editor of Charlie Hebdo. His name is Girard, Birard. He wasn't present in the office when they were attacked. He was over in London. That came out in a different part of the interview. He was exclusively over on NBC's Meet the Press, and Chuck Todd asked him to respond to what Pope Francis had said, and here's his response in this clip.
I want to get into some of the criticism that the publication has received, including from Pope Francis, and I want to get your response to the Pope answering a reporter's question about the extent of freedom of expression. The Pope illustrated his point by describing what would happen if his personal Vatican aide, Alberto Gaspari, said something bad against his mother. And the Pope said this: "To kill in the name of God is an aberration. We have the obligation to say openly, to have this liberty, but without giving offense, because it is true, one cannot react violently. But if Dr. Gaspari, a good friend, says a bad word against my mother, then a punch awaits him. But it's normal. It's normal. One cannot provoke. One cannot insult other people's faith. One cannot make fun of faith." What do you say to the Pope?
Every time that we draw a cartoon of Mohammed, every time that we draw a cartoon of a prophet, every time that we draw a cartoon of God, we defend the freedom of religion. We declare that God must not be a political or public figure. He must be a private figure. We defend the freedom of religion. Yes, it's also the freedom of speech, but it is the freedom of religion. Religion should not be a political argument. If religious arguments step into the political arena, it becomes a totalitarian argument. Secularism protects us against this. Secularism guarantees democracy and assures peace. Secularism allows all believers and all non-believers to live in peace, and that is what we defend.
And I think that argument is pretty good as far as it goes, although I think I'm going to disagree a little bit with this second clip from the same editor of Charlie Hebdo, Girard, Birard, where Chuck Todd asked him to react to news organizations, including NBC, not showing the cover of his magazine, and he basically says that's okay for those who are in countries where they could face, really legal or violent repercussions, but for the newspapers and media outlets in Western democracies that they're like supporting totalitarianism by not printing these Charlie Hebdo cartoons or Hebdo cartoons. You can see that over in this clip.
Just curious of your reaction. Many news organizations, including our own, have not shown your cover completely, either blurred out, and it's a decision we made editorially. No government told us to do anything, but it was a decision we made, and every news organization is making their own decisions. What is your reaction to our decision and others who have chosen not to show your cover?
Écoutez, on ne peut pas reprocher.
Listen, we cannot blame newspapers that already suffer much difficulty in getting published and distributed in totalitarian regimes for not publishing a cartoon which could cost them, at best, jail, and at worst, death. On the other hand, I am quite critical of newspapers which are published in democratic countries. This cartoon is not just a little figure, a little Mohammed drawn by Luz. It's a symbol. It's the symbol of freedom of speech, of freedom of religion, of democracy, and secularism. It is this symbol that these newspapers refuse to publish. This is what they must understand. When they refuse to publish this cartoon, when they blur it out, when they decline to publish it, they blur out democracy, secularism, freedom of religion, and they insult the citizenship.
So, I mean, I don't know if that's true. I mean, I actually think that most news organizations in this case should have reprinted the cartoons and the cover because it was newsworthy, but that's because of the attack. As to whether they should print that kind of thing without it being a newsworthy piece of information because of the attack, I mean, I think that they all have their own right to decide their own level of taste. And I mean, haven't looked through all the cartoons, but some of them do seem kind of racist and Islamophobic, and not that means that they don't have a right to print them or don't have a right to print them without provoking any sort of violent reaction. That's not the argument I'm making at all. But in terms of taste and civility, I do think that there is some merit to what people like Glenn Greenwald have said in that article that I put a link down to in the video description. Before I leave the topic of free speech and get over into the terrorist threat, there are a couple sort of related clips that aren't about Islamic free speech, but are about free speech in general. First one is from Mike Huckabee. He was over on ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos talking to Martha Raddatz, who was guest hosting this week. And she asked him about his negative comments about Beyonce. I guess if Mike Huckabee runs for president, we're going to be talking about song lyrics and whether we should be shaming people for their song lyrics. And I guess that's kind of a free speech issue I wanted to talk about a little more after I show you that clip here.
I want to go back to your book in the short time we have here. And you, as John Carl mentioned, taking on Beyonce, Jay-Z, and criticizing the Obamas for letting their girls listen to Beyonce.
You know, if people read the full chapter, it's in the context of, first of all, saying Beyonce is a wonderful talent. My point is, she doesn't have to do some of the things that she does in the lyrics because it's not necessary. She has nothing to make up for it. She's an amazing talent. My point was, even in speaking about the Obamas, and I said about them in the book, they're great parents. But it was President Obama in an interview with Glamour who said that some of the lyrics he won't listen to with his daughters because it embarrasses him. Well, here's my point. If it embarrasses you, then why would you possibly think it's wholesome for your children to put it into their heads? So that's the point. If you're very concerned about what happens with your children, and the Obamas are, they're great parents, they're careful about making sure their kids get a lot of vegetables and eat right, that's terrific. Well, what you put in your brain is also important, as well as what you put into your body. And that was my point, based on what the president himself said. So I think if people read the chapter, they see that it's about this cultural divide, the disconnect between the three bubbles of New York, D.C., and Hollywood versus the land of God, guns, grits, and gravy. That's where the title comes from.
And the Bubba land. You also said quickly, Governor.
So I don't know what you all think about that. You can let me know in the comment section, and I'm reading the comments while the clip is playing also to see what you were thinking about the previous clip. So I appreciate all of you who are watching this live with me. The last clip I want to show on free speech, this also has to do with sort of right-wing speech, and this is, I promised a clip from Bill Maher that I agree with on free speech. This is where he talks about how he is against censoring people like Rush Limbaugh, or even the people who try to boycott the sponsors of Rush Limbaugh. And I know I actually disagree with some of my friends on the left there, because there are a lot of people who are trying to get Rush Limbaugh's sponsors to stop sponsoring him. And the one thing I think Bill Maher misses out on in his commentary is that boycotts are also a form of free speech. I just think that secondary boycotts, where you boycott people for sponsoring other things that you disagree with, that is like one step too far, and I've talked about that in the past. But here's Bill Maher making his argument on that issue in this clip.
And that goes for everybody. This may surprise you, but I am not a big fan of Rush Limbaugh. However, if you're one of the people with a website devoted to making him go away, you are part of the problem. And ironically, you're not even a proper liberal, because you don't get free speech. You're just a baby who can't stand to live in a world where you hear things that upset you. Oh, you're not alone. In much of Europe, denying the Holocaust is a crime. It shouldn't be. The French arrested an anti-Semitic comedian this week for his comments about the attack, which were vile. But opinions shouldn't be illegal. Everyone can always come up with a reason why the thing that bugs you should get a waiver. But free speech only works if there are no waivers. No waivers, including for religion. Like, say you are, and I'm just picking a religion at random here, Muslim. And you love you some Islam. It's what uplifts you and inspires you, and you can't imagine your life without it, or why everyone else doesn't love it too. Believe me, I get that. That's how I feel about weed. But when someone criticizes weed, I think, good, more for me. Not off with their head.
Now, I actually agree with just about everything Bill Maher said there, and I'm not a supporter of these boycotts of Rush Limbaugh, or boycotts of Rush Limbaugh's sponsors. If you want to boycott Rush Limbaugh and not listen to him, that's how you stop from being offended by his speech. But to go so far as to like try to boycott people, companies that advertise on that, that is a very severe step. I don't completely rule it out, but I think it is usually too far. Secondary boycotts, I think, are too much of a free speech violation. And of course, Bill Maher is against them because that's how he lost his show on ABC, basically, is that they wouldn't sponsor him. There were sponsors who were worried about these secondary boycotts, and that's why he's on HBO. So I understand why Bill Maher takes that side, and I pretty much agree with him, but he should also realize that secondary boycotts, even if you don't want to participate in one, are a form of free speech. And so not pointing that out is also not understanding free speech, maybe, from Bill Maher. So I guess I disagreed with him a little bit, but I also want to talk a little bit about a free speech issue at the beginning of this next big topic of the terrorist threat. And this is going to be Al-Qaeda and ISIS and Syria and even Boko Haram. But first I want to show a sort of extended report on this. This is from NBC's Richard Engel, who's given several good extended reports I've shown in the last few weeks. And this includes a report on the reaction to these Je suis Charlie demonstrations is actually being misunderstood by some Muslims as being in favor of insulting the Prophet Muhammad rather than in favor of the free speech, kind of what I was talking about before. But also, Richard Engel, like I said, there's a longer report that includes reporting on the general counterterrorism response across Europe, and there was that incident in Belgium earlier in the week, and that's in this clip here.
All over Europe, police and counterterrorism officers have been raiding homes, making arrests, and at one address in Belgium, exchanging heavy fire with suspected terrorists who authorities say were just about ready to launch an attack. Most of the targets are militants who have long been under surveillance and are being pulled in all at once in the wake of the terror attacks in Paris. Europe is stepping up its efforts to stop homegrown terrorists and continuing to send jets to bomb ISIS targets in Iraq. The French Parliament broke into a spontaneous rendition of the national anthem after it voted to recommit the nation to fighting ISIS. President Hollande got a well-photographed tour of a warship to show his own commitment. But the fact is, the U.S. is doing most of the bombing in Syria and Iraq. About 5 of every 6 sorties are conducted by American jets.
We are systematically taking out their fighters. We're destroying their infrastructure. We are putting them on the defensive and helping local forces in Iraq push these terrorists back.
But are they on the defensive? There's another way to look at the Paris attacks, as Islamists starting a counter-offensive.
Things like that cost them almost nothing, but yet it creates a huge amount of furor and fear and anger in the West. So for a very small investment, they're able to have a big psychological effect, and that's the way that they actually are on the offensive and have the initiative.
Being bombed by the U.S. and its allies has elevated ISIS's status and upped its recruiting game. Now, both ISIS and al-Qaeda are telling their supporters in the West that they don't have to travel to Syria and Iraq to join the war. They can stay at home, find targets, and attack. In addition, the massive demonstrations in support of the satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo and the immense popularity of its most recent issue have enraged Muslim protesters around the world. At least 3 demonstrators were killed by police in the French-speaking former West African colony Niger. Angry protests have erupted in other former French colonies from Mali to Algeria. The slogan, "I am Charlie," meant to express solidarity and a defense of freedom of speech, is being understood in parts of the Muslim world to mean "I am with those who ridicule the Prophet Muhammad." And that misunderstanding, with its suggestion of a wider cultural and religious war, helps ISIS and other terrorist groups with a weapon that no jet can destroy: the weapon of propaganda.
So I really like that Richard Engel report, because it talked about the way that this is actually a cheap way for the terrorist groups from the Middle East to get a lot of bang for their buck, so to speak. That, like, the Charlie Hebdo attack didn't cost hardly anything and got all this worldwide attention. It's still reverberating 10 days later, and so in a way it's a counteroffensive that the terrorists are undertaking. I want to show another extended report. This is from ABC's Alex Marquardt, sort of a different angle on it that I will discuss after you see that clip over here.
An intense feeling of nervousness in Europe this morning. You can see here at the American Embassy the increased security measures that have been taken, a scene playing out across the continent as authorities try to prevent another attack. Across Europe this morning, countries at their highest alert. In France, following the Paris attacks, 120,000 soldiers and police in the streets. In the UK, the threat level against police raised to a level never before seen, indicating an attack is very likely. And here in Belgium, heavily armed troops patrolling the streets for the first time in 30 years. You can see here these Belgian soldiers armed with machine guns standing outside the American Embassy, one of many sites officials fear could be a target. As security is beefed up, the authorities are also cracking down. In the past 72 hours, almost 36 people across Europe have been arrested on suspicion of terror-related activity. Just last night, 2 detained in Athens, Greece. Belgian media reporting that authorities are hunting for a 27-year-old Belgian who went to Syria to fight with ISIS, now possibly in Greece. Belgium is a tiny country with just over 11 million people, but some 300 to 400 young men have traveled to Syria to fight, the highest per capita of any Western country. Some of them arrested on Thursday in a series of Belgian raids. just hours before authorities say a terror cell was going to launch attacks against the police. In their hideout, AK-47s, explosives, and police uniforms. It's not just police who are believed to be some of the main targets, but Europe's Jewish communities as well.
The threat is serious because they are a target we know terrorists like. They need to be protected.
In Paris, where anti-Semitism is on the rise, we saw police evacuating a synagogue.
All the signs are there. You see the police outside of the synagogue? You don't see them outside of a mosque. It's quite logic.
Is it getting worse?
I hope not.
Top European counterterrorism officials say that with all the Europeans going to fight in Syria, there are thousands of potential terrorists who could carry out attacks, another of which they say is inevitable.
So that was definitely a report that hyped the threat from terrorism, and I don't think it really had that asymmetrical warfare analysis you saw from Richard Engel on NBC's Meet the Press, where he was talking about the way that this is actually a win for the terrorists when they get all this media coverage and all this disruption of Western democracies. And in terms of hyping the threat, one thing I noticed they said in that ABC report is that the threat in the United Kingdom is greater than it's ever been. But over on CBS's Face the Nation, Bob Schieffer specifically asked that of the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, David Cameron, and he talked about how there's a long British history of these kinds of threats, so he didn't want to say greatest ever, but he did also say that another attack was highly likely over in this clip.
And we asked if the terrorist threat now is greater than ever.
In Britain's history, we've had some very intense times of terrorist threats, so I wouldn't want to try and scale it in that way. But certainly we face a very severe threat. That's what we're calling it, severe, because we believe an attack is highly likely. But frankly, we've been in this struggle against extremist Islamist terrorism now for well over a decade and a half. So we know what it takes to win, but it's going to take a lot of perseverance.
Well, have we...
So that's David Cameron saying highly likely attack, like I said, but not the greatest threat ever, like it said in the ABC report. And then also back over on ABC, they had on the head of the European police, Rob Wainwright, to talk about what's going on across Europe. And I'll talk about that a little more if you see that clip here.
Well, what we're seeing now, Martha, actually is a determined police response right across Europe to deal in the aftermath of the terrible attacks in Paris. We've seen action now in Belgium, in Greece, in Berlin, and other locations as well. And it shows, I think, the nature of the threat that we're facing right now. It's spread across so many European countries, perpetrated by a community of possibly thousands of people who have been radicalized on the internet by their conflict experience in Syria and Iraq, and many of them have returned to European society, perhaps some of them with the intent and capability to carry out the attack. And to your question, I'm not sure that there is such a network, an organized network, of people who are operating under a command and control structure. It's a lot more diffuse and unconnected in nature than that.
Which can be even more dangerous,
I suspect. A lot of independent or semi-independent people. Of course, that makes it much more dangerous, Martha, and that's the real challenge that the police face now, not just dealing with the scale of the problem, the numbers of people involved, but the way in which it's much looser than we've seen before. It's not the same as in the days of 9/11 when we had an identifiable command and control structure. Something much more difficult now, moving rather insidiously in our communities and across the internet in particular. It's a real challenge for police right now.
So yeah, in that clip and the ones before it, all that put together, it sounds like very likely there'll be some kind of additional attack in Europe in the near future. That's at least what both the reporters and the officials are saying, in, as you saw there. And a lot of the new threat comes from, I guess, in Europe. They call it, I guess they're homegrown in Europe, but there's also a hyping of this homegrown threat in the United States that I'm going to talk about with a few clips. First, an extended clip from Pierre Thomas on ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos also. Here he's talking about the threat of U.S. homegrown terrorists, but there are a couple problems I had with this report. First, they talk about this recent arrest of this guy Chris Cornell in Ohio, and I think there are some that might be one of these entrapment cases where everything he did, he was like talked into by government agents posing as fellow terrorists or whatever. And then the other thing is, this, like I said, this is a discussion about U.S. homegrown terrorists, and there's about halfway through this clip, you'll see Pierre Thomas talks about a bunch of homegrown U.S. terrorists or U.S. extremists. I can't remember. I know the word homegrown is definitely in there. And the first picture you see is this Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalib, the underwear bomber, who is from Nigeria, grew up in Nigeria. He went and trained in Yemen, but there's no way that guy was a U.S. homegrown terrorist. So I actually tweeted Pierre Thomas about that earlier today and never got a response, but it is a Sunday. And you can see that Pierre Thomas response report, and I'll talk a little bit more about it after you watch it. Let me make sure I get the right one. I think it's this clip.
In Washington, President Obama meeting with the British Prime Minister amid terror fears.
Al-Qaeda and ISIL are actively trying to inspire and support people within our own countries.
The threat from homegrown radicals is real, as we see unfold in this undercover FBI video. Amin El-Khalifi caught in an FBI sting plotting a massacre of Congress. Seen here going into Home Depot buying nails to use as shrapnel in a suicide vest.
Thick ones I got, thick ones, not thin ones. The one who's gonna make damage, right? Yeah.
Later, driving into a West Virginia quarry with men he thought were Al-Qaeda to test a suicide bomb.
I want you to place the call so you can see how it works. Okay, now hit send. Allahu Akbar.
In the end, complaining the bomb wasn't big enough.
No, but brother, this is not strong enough, man.
Khalifi was arrested in 2012, just 2 blocks from Capitol Hill. The FBI says he was inspired in part by the online post of Al-Qaeda radical cleric Anwar al-Awlaki, killed by the U.S. in 2011.
There is a population of young folks, largely young men, who connect with that extremist message.
And there may be many more like Khalifi. Christopher Lee Cornell, a 20-year-old from Ohio, was arrested just this week after buying 2 M15 assault rifles, allegedly planning his own attack on Capitol Hill. Cornell is one of more than 50 suspected homegrown extremists arrested by the FBI in recent years, many radicalized online and through social media. And in the last year alone, at least 12 Americans caught trying to join ISIS in Syria. Then there's the threat of Al-Qaeda cells in Syria and Yemen still targeting the West. No specific plot has been identified, but could there be sleeper cells here?
I think there are sleeper cells not only in France, but certainly in other countries, and yes, even in our own.
I don't think that we have any information that would indicate, certainly with regard to the homeland, that there is any ongoing threat.
So that's a yes and a no from 2 different Democrats there at the end as to whether there are sleeper cells in the United States. But they talked about that Chris Cornell guy who, I guess his father went to court and said he was a mama's boy and he never would have done anything if he hadn't been talked into it by some kind of confidential informant. And I know there was a Lodi case here in Lodi, California. There was a case where they pretty much entrapped this guy into supposedly showing material support for terrorism, and a lot of the cases that have come out since 9/11 have been where the FBI goes out and trolls for people and talks them into taking these steps. They are obviously not the best characters, and they have a lot of problems, and they may even be dangerous, but you don't want the plot to be instigated by the FBI agents, I don't think. And did you notice right after he talked about Chris Cornell, he showed a montage of photos, and after the Chris Cornell photo, the next one was that guy Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalib, the underwear bomber, who was not homegrown, as the narration was claiming he was U.S. homegrown. He was like I said, a Nigerian. So I don't know what that was doing there. But also on the threat of homegrown terrorism, I want to show Marco Rubio over on CBS's Face the Nation. I have a couple clips from him tonight. This is the one on terrorism where Bob Schieffer asks him, introduces him, I think this is where he introduces him as like possibly running for president, and then asks him about the threat level and whether it's more dangerous. And Marco Rubio specifically talks about the threat of homegrown terrorism. That, I'm sure, is in this clip right here.
He is also one of many Republicans thinking of running for president. Senator, thank you for joining us. Prime Minister Cameron is obviously worried about more terrorist attacks. Do you believe the danger is increasing? There will be another attack on this country?
I do, and I think in addition to the traditional risk of terrorism, which is what we experienced at 9/11, people from the Middle East coming to the U.S., hijacking an airplane, crashing it into a building, in addition to that sort of threat, which remains real, there's also the threat of homegrown violent extremism, which we've been warning about now for a couple years. And what's made it more interesting, of course, and more dangerous is that, in fact, some of these individuals that are plotting these attacks may not even have traveled to the Middle East. They've been radicalized in a local mosque or online, and they've received instructions and or inspiration about how to carry out these attacks in the West from online platforms. So I think that's a very real risk for Europe, which is closer to the Middle East and has large immigrant populations from that region. But it's a real risk here in the United States, a country where every single year millions of people visit, travel to, immigrate to.
Well, are you...
No, I didn't really hear a specific threat there. That was kind of the conflict between Senator Dianne Feinstein and Attorney General Eric Holder in the end of the last clip from ABC, where she said there may be sleeper cells, but he said no specific information. And that didn't really stop them from really hyping the threat over on Fox News Sunday. Shannon Bream had on two Republican senators, two senators, one Republican, one Democrat. There's actually a Democratic senator this time. The Republican is Ron Johnson, the Democrat is Ben Cardin. First, here is the beginning of their discussion of terrorism, where Shannon Bream says, should we be afraid of the homegrown threat here in the United States? And Senator Ron Johnson actually admits there's no specific threat, but still says we should be afraid because of what happened in Europe, I guess, over in this clip.
Mr. Chairman, I'll start with you. What is your take right now? Do you believe that there are lone wolves or sleeper cells here in the U.S. Motivated by radical ideology that are either capable of and or planning attacks on the U.S. homeland?
I'm not aware of any specific cells, any sleeper cells, but when you're seeing what's happening in Europe and you're seeing how widespread that is, from France to Belgium to Germany, I think you have to assume that that is certainly a risk that we do have to consider, and we have to do everything we can to make sure that our intelligence agencies are working cooperatively with other foreign intelligence agencies, and that our agencies here in America are also fully communicating so we don't have those stovepipes which really led to 9/11 a dozen years ago.
That question seemed like, or that answer seemed like it might have come from a dozen years ago, I guess, but a more updated threat came from Shannon Bream hosting Fox News Sunday, talking again to the Republican Senator Ron Johnson there, where she started off with a graphic of the territory that ISIS holds within Syria, and it starts off as like a moderate red blob and then becomes a bigger red blob, which of course looks very threatening, although I guess before that the territory was held by Bashar al-Assad, which is, I don't know if that's necessarily less threatening, but anyway, I'll talk about that a little more if you see that clip here.
I want to put up a map showing what appears to be almost a doubling of the territory controlled by ISIS, and that's since we began airstrikes with coalition forces in that area. We also have the complication of Bashar al-Assad still operating in that area, and there are many reports that his forces and those loyal to him are actually fighting against the forces that we're counting on to fight against ISIS. What does this administration need to do with regard to Syria?
Well, what we need to do is we need to accomplish the goal that President Obama stated: degrade and ultimately defeat ISIS, and the sooner the better. The problem is we're not seeing the kind of leadership out of President Obama to actually accomplish that goal. We had a mini debate on authorization for use of military force. the commander-in-chief wouldn't even bring forward the language in terms of the authorization he needed. We need to define what he means by defeat. He needs to define a strategy for actually accomplishing that goal. And then he's got to come to Congress asking for the authority to accomplish that, to employ that strategy and accomplish that goal.
So those were like the two softball questions that Shannon Bream on Fox News Sunday asked the Republican senator. The Democratic senator, Ben Cardin, on the other hand, got a more difficult question. This is asking Ben Cardin about the whole boots on the ground and whether we need boots on the ground. And of course, on Fox News Sunday, they really want more boots on the ground. But Shannon Bream talked about how many advisors, not combat troops, are going to both Syria and Iraq, and then played a clip of Secretary of State John Kerry testifying before Congress saying that there wouldn't be a combat role for U.S. troops, and then questioning Ben Cardin about, what does that all mean? And of course, Ben Cardin defended Obama policy, which at least you get a little bit of that on Fox News Sunday this morning over, let's see, this is clip 29. Is it 28 or 20? Sorry, let me make sure I get the right clip here. Yeah, clip number 28 here.
That point, we know that the Defense Department is reporting there could be 1,000 or more U.S. trainers that are going to head overseas to that region and going to be there to train Syrian opposition forces. We already have 2,000 personnel, U.S. personnel on the ground in Iraq. We're told that number could go as high as 3,400 later this year. And all along, though, the administration has said no boots on the ground, a very specific, language that they've been using there. I want to play a little bit of what Secretary of State John Kerry said when he was testifying before you at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee last December.
The president has been crystal clear that his policy is that U.S. military forces will not be deployed to conduct ground combat operations against ISIL.
Okay, so a strategy, troops in, troops out. Senator Cardin, at what point do you think the president has an obligation to come to you for that authorization for use of military force with regard to ISIS?
No, I think he should come to us for the use of force, and I've been pretty vocal about the fact that Congress has a responsibility to clarify exactly what the president's authority is. But I want to disagree with Senator Johnson in regards to the president's strategy. I think the president is right. This is a complicated situation. In Iraq, we think a stable government that includes moderate Sunnis is critically important to cut off the support for ISIL. So we're working on that. We do have a greater ground capacity in Iraq to deal with the growth of ISIL than we do in Syria. In Syria, we're doing a training mission, and we started that training mission. We're giving air support. But I agree with the president. I don't want to see us involved in a protracted ground campaign where we saw in Iraq that was ineffective as far as the ultimate security of that country. I think it's important that the ground support be done by those in the countries themselves.
All right.
So that was a, mediocre answer, I thought, by Senator Ben Cardin to a more confrontational question, of course, from the Fox News Sunday host, especially Shannon Bream, the guest host, against the Democrat than the Republican. And my favorite part of that interview with the two senators was when Shannon Bream decided to hype the threat from Guantanamo, first asking Senator Ben Cardin about the threat from these 5 Yemenis who were released this last week, and the two parts that I like about this answer. First, Senator Ben Cardin mispronounces Guantanamo 3 times in his answer, which, I guess I mispronounce a bunch of things during my broadcast, but seems a bit much for a senator, especially the 3rd time I think he mispronounces Guantanamo Bay as Guantanamo Gay, well, you tell me. And then I also like the way that Shannon Bream fits in the Republican talking points about the authorization for use of military force when Ben Cardin brings that up at the end of the answer. over in this clip.
What inspires these groups? The administration said this week again that Guantanamo Bay has been an inspiration for terror groups. So, Senator Cardin, I want to pivot to that question. 5 more releases this week. These were men from Yemen who have all kinds of accusations against them. And they're being released to areas like Oman, which, of course, shares a border with Yemen. We're told that the Kouachi brothers in Paris had traveled in that area, possibly gotten training, terror training in Yemen, and then, of course, returned home. So is this the time right now to be releasing detainees like the ones we saw released just days ago?
It may not be the time to release these detainees, but it's certainly past time to close Guantanamo Bay. The cost to the American taxpayers, those funds can be put to much better use in protecting the security of our country. It's millions of dollars per inmate that we're spending to maintain Guantanamo Bay, where we could, if Congress would permit, transfer some to the United States. We know how to keep them safe from the public, or we could bring them to justice, or we could transfer them to other countries where they could handle it. But to continue Guantanamo Bay is not only an expensive, but it's also an iconic symbol to the world of a past that we want to move away from. One last point, if I might, on the use of force. The president's operating on the use of force against ISIL based upon 2000 and 2001 authorizations from Congress. Circumstances have changed dramatically since those days. It's critically important that Congress exercise its responsibility and pass an authorization for the use of military force for the president.
And what I continue to hear from folks on both sides of the aisle on the Hill is that they need to hear from the administration those specifics. So we'll watch to see if that is coming in the days and weeks ahead, as both sides are asking for it now.
So yeah, at the end there, Shannon Bream is like making sure that she rebuts what Senator Ben Cardin said about it actually being Congress's responsibility to decide what it wants to say about declaring war or being against the use of military force, that Congress has an independent responsibility. No, she's following the Republican line there, that it's up to the president to define the mission and come to Congress and ask for specific authority and specific language, and it's his lack of leadership that means that Congress doesn't have to do anything, I guess. I think that may be the Republican position, but I want to share one more clip from that Fox News exchange. This is the softball question that Shannon Bream then asks the Republican about Guantanamo, and lets him get away with pronouncing it correctly at least, but giving a whole bunch of misinformation, especially about who's there. You'll remember a clip I showed from Meet the Press recently. They talked about how about half the people at Guantanamo have actually been cleared for release, but you'll see here that Shannon Bream doesn't correct the Republican at all when he says that they're the worst of the worst and really evil, and I'll talk about that a little more if you see that clip right here.
I want to play a bite from Josh Earnest this week talking about Guantanamo Bay, and Senator Johnson then give you a chance to respond. Here's what he said.
The prison at Guantanamo Bay continues to inspire violent acts around the globe. So it's not as if we can avoid violence by just keeping the prison open and keeping them all locked up.
All right, so Senator Johnson, Senator Cardin says we know how to handle these people here. You can transfer them to U.S. prisons. So far, Congress, in a bipartisan way, has done a very good job of blocking the administration from doing that. So what do you do with these people?
Well, the people left in Guantanamo Bay are evil people, and they will, many of them will return to the battle. One of the first line of defenses, one of the most important things we have to do is we have to have an effective intelligence gathering capability. And one of the ways you do that is you capture these unlawful combatants and you detain them. And then over a long period of time, you interrogate them. That's how you really develop the intelligence to try to foil future plots. And the fact that we're going to try and close Guantanamo, the fact that we don't have any place to put terrorists that we capture is really degrading our ability to gather that type of intelligence to keep America safe and secure. So this is no time to be transferring these individuals that are all high risk now. That's what's left. I mean, we've released literally hundreds of prisoners from Guantanamo. The people there are the worst of the worst, and they should not be released.
Okay, that's all Shannon Bream said at the end there was okay. Didn't challenge the Republican senator at all, saying that they're the worst of the worst, even though about half of them have actually been cleared for release. And no charges against most of them. I mean, what happened to due process? I guess I talked about that earlier in the show, due process. But anyway, the next question I want to show is a more confrontational question asked of a Republican on this issue. This is Chuck Todd over on NBC's Meet the Press had Senator Lindsey Graham on, who is a very pro-military action Republican. One question I'm not going to show is where Chuck Todd asked him about being John McCain's illegitimate child. That was like some comment that John McCain made recently, and that was in terms of Lindsey Graham running for president. You can see the whole interview by clicking on the link down in the video description to the Meet the Press webpage, where they have every episode of Meet the Press available, at least for a while, and certainly by the time you watch the show it's available. Anyway, here's Lindsey Graham answering a tougher question from Chuck Todd about the war on terror and the use of ground troops specifically, and whether it makes any sense given that it hasn't worked for like 15 years now, or 14 years, over in this clip.
With a basic question that I've been hearing from a lot of folks over the last 14 years, the policy of going after these terrorist groups has been to disrupt, dismantle, and destroy. It was George W. Bush's policy promise. It's been President Obama's. 14 years, we've killed a lot of people, but we've not defeated this enemy. Why?
Well, once you liberate a country like Iraq and you don't have a follow-on force, they fill in the gaps. Syria is a failed state. The civil war in Syria basically broke the country apart. And the only thing I can say is you have to deny the enemy safe haven. Withdrawing from Iraq prematurely was a mistake. Not supporting the Free Syrian Army 3 or 4 years ago was a mistake. You got to stay after these guys.
Well, Senator, I guess I would just say, are you advocating then more troops in a place like Syria now? More troops, potentially? Is it Yemen that we need to do? I mean, what is the answer now? I know we want to debate about some of these things in the past about Iraq, but what's the answer now?
Well, the answer now is to deny ISIL the safe haven they enjoy in Syria and Iraq, because it is a platform to strike the United States. There are more Parises coming until you disrupt this network. There are more terrorist organizations with more safe havens, with more capability to hit the homeland than before 9/11. The answer is to form a regional coalition. America has to be part of it, go in on the ground and get these guys out of Syria. The current strategy is failing. Everybody has told us on this trip that if you don't have a no-fly zone, the people we're training, the Free Syrian Army that we're training, is going to go back into Syria and get slaughtered by Assad. There's no way to be successful on the ground without neutralizing Assad's air advantage, and so we need a no-fly zone desperately.
Now there are a lot of complications involved in getting into Syria, and I'm not going to go into all that, but I do want to show another interesting question that Chuck Todd asked Senator Lindsey Graham on this morning's Meet the Press. And this is an issue I saw people commenting on the LiberalViewer Sunday Live Clip Roundup last week after it became a recorded show, about the difference between the 17 people killed in the attacks in Paris versus a couple thousand people killed by Boko Haram in Nigeria. And Chuck Todd asked Senator Lindsey Graham about that disparity over in this clip.
Vicious radical Islamic group might actually be in Nigeria. You didn't bring it up. A lot of people don't bring it up until it's asked. Boko Haram slaughtered thousands in the same week that 17 people were killed in Paris. Should the United States be doing more in Nigeria? Other countries? What's the answer there?
Well, I think, we should be doing more, but Boko Haram doesn't represent the threat to the homeland, in my view, that ISIL does, and al-Nusra and other groups in Syria and Iraq. But this problem is spreading throughout the world. What the next stage of the fight, I think, is Africa. But if we could show some resolve in Syria and Iraq and reset the table and go after these guys in Syria and Iraq with success, I think it would change the landscape throughout the world. Success anywhere breeds success everywhere. Failure in any one spot hurts you everywhere. But you're right. 2,000 people were killed in one weekend in Nigeria, and the world basically ignored the story.
So I don't know if Boko Haram is less of a threat to our U.S. national security, if that's really the reason. You can let me know what you think down in the comment section. But Chuck Todd was not the only person to bring up Boko Haram and the thousands of people killed there compared to the 17 people killed in Paris. That was also, I mentioned Jim Sciutto, the guest host of CNN's State of the Union, asked a bunch of good questions. That's one of the good questions he asked Democratic Senator Chris Murphy over on that program this morning in this clip.
Boko Haram, because last week, while we were focused on the Paris attacks, you had a horrible atrocity committed by Boko Haram north of Nigeria, perhaps as many as 2,000 killed. CNN had its reporter on the scene as well. And I just want to show you a political cartoon here that made a point that was not unusual, focusing, of course, all the attention that there was on Paris, some would argue ignoring what's happening in Nigeria. A number of months ago, when those girls went missing, Boko Haram, the White House focused, you'll remember, Bring Back Our Girls was a popular Twitter hashtag. There was talk of U.S. military cooperation there, particularly intelligence and surveillance to help locate the girls. Is the U.S. helping fight Boko Haram, and are we minimizing, because this, of course, is another terror threat, are we minimizing the terror threat emanating from Boko Haram?
Well, I do think it's unfortunate that there hasn't been as much world attention as there should be on this increasing threat from Boko Haram. We're seeing literally thousands of deaths due to their terrorist activities. 12 deaths in Paris is an atrocity, but it shouldn't excuse us from paying attention to what's happening in Africa. I hope that we'll have conversations in the Foreign Relations Committee in the coming weeks about some new assets that the United States can provide to those fighting Boko Haram on the ground. It deserves an equal amount of attention from the United States. Now, I think the reason in which we have seen more attention on Paris is that the organizations that are claiming responsibility, whether it be Al-Qaeda or ISIS, are making more credible and have a history of more credible threats against the United States. That's why this deserves a good degree of American attention. But Boko Haram unchecked is a threat not just to the region, but the entire world, and it deserves our attention as well.
So there, the Democratic Senator Chris Murphy actually agreed with what the Republican Senator Lindsey Graham said in that previous clip about the reason there's more focus on Paris than Nigeria is the more direct and historical threat to U.S. national security. Although then Chris Murphy goes a little further and says Boko Haram could be a threat to the U.S. and the whole world, which I don't know. I never really thought of it. I mean, I think what they do in Nigeria and the surrounding areas there is pretty awful, but I never really thought of them as like bent on world conquest. But maybe I'm missing something. You can let me know what you think down in the comment section. I want to show another clip here from Chris Murphy answering another good question from Jim Sciutto. It kind of reminds me of the endless war topic that I showed from NBC's Meet the Press a couple weeks back. Jim Sciutto doesn't actually use the term endless war. He talks about perennial war, and he gets an answer about what the U.S. needs to consider in terms of its foreign policy that I think is not aired often enough on the corporate media, and I'll talk about that a little more if you see it in this clip.
Fair point. I want to ask you, you've made some interesting comments this week talking about the perennial nature of America's wars and how that may contribute to extremism. It echoes to some degree the comments made more than a decade ago by the Defense Secretary at the time, Donald Rumsfeld, who, in his words, are we creating more of them than we are killing, in effect? And I wonder if you could make your point here. Are you saying that by repeated military intervention in Iraq, in Afghanistan, drone strikes in countries such as Yemen, that there is a downside to that helps recruit extremists? I might mention that one of the Kawashi brothers in court papers said specifically that it was the U.S. invasion of Iraq and the abuse at Abu Ghraib that led him to want to go fight American forces there.
Well, here's the first and most important thing. There is never a justification, an excuse, a rationale for these kind of murderous terrorist attacks. The only people to blame for these murders in Paris and other assaults around the world are the individuals who perpetuated them. But my point has been simply this. We shouldn't be full of such hubris here in the United States that we don't have a conversation about the fact that there are things that we do, there are actions that we take that can create more terrorists, create more threats to the United States, and there are things that we can do, actions that we can take that will create less terrorists across the world. And I think that's a useful conversation to have. I have argued, and I think many others would agree with me, that the war in Iraq, which became a recruiting tool for Islamic extremists all around the world, made this country less safe, not more safe. I would argue that the way in which we have conducted drone strikes in some parts of the world have become bulletin board recruiting material for many of these terrorist organizations. That doesn't create a rationale, a justification for anything that has happened, but it just, I think, should create a conversation here in the United States about being careful about conducting a foreign policy in a way that ends up creating more of the very kind of people and organizations that we're trying to fight.
Now, would you
Wow, that was pretty awesome. I mean, that's really what gets lost in a lot of the discussions in the corporate media about, they talk about how we have to take all these responsive actions to the beheadings by ISIS or whatever, and they don't realize the way our drone policy and our military intervention policy and a variety of other things that we do actually creates additional terrorists. And I want to show a couple more clips from CNN State of the Union on the terrorism topic. First, this is Jim Sciutto talking to the new Republican chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, Richard Burr, asking him to figure out what does it mean that two of the Paris terrorists were followers of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and then the guy at the kosher deli had some sort of affiliation to ISIS. Are they like in conflict, or are they cooperating, or what does that mean? And you can see that over in this clip. I don't know why that. Let me try that. Oh, sorry, one more time. Here it goes. Okay, I think I fixed it last time.
There was an odd joint, in effect, claim of responsibility. You have AQAP claiming responsibility for the Paris attacks, but you have the attacker at the kosher market in Paris pledging allegiance to ISIS. Is the U.S. aware of any increased cooperation between a group such as AQAP and ISIS?
Jim, we're not, but I think it's foolish to think that two groups competing for fighters and competing for money wouldn't go out and claim some degree of credit for this. And I think that that's one thing that these groups all share, is they're pulling from the same pool of fighters, and they're pulling from the same resources for financing from around the world. So being part of that spectacular attack. And I might say that I think we've overlooked the fact that Belgium is an intelligence win. Individuals that we knew about, individuals that were watched, the Belgian government made a decision to go for a particular reason when they did. And I think you've seen how seriously they take what they found. Hundreds of troops in Belgium, never seen before. Over 20,000 troops in France right now, helping in the fight against terrorism, and a capture of over 20 in 5 or 6 different countries just in the last 48 hours.
Sorry, it took me so long to play that clip. I don't know exactly. I messed up the settings there. And the final clip I want to play on the terrorism topic is also from CNN State of the Union. There's a quick intro from Jim Sciutto, and then he goes to a reporter they actually have over in Sana'a, Yemen, which is one of the great things I thought about the CNN report is they actually had someone in Yemen, and that's his name. Let me make sure I get his name right, because he's a three-name person. Nick Patton Walsh, sorry. And he talks about what's going on with Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and the fact that there's this Shia group that is also involved in the civil war, or I don't know if it's like a tripartite civil war, that's actually working to the advantage of Al-Qaeda. In the final clip on the terrorism topic for tonight in this.
Paris, I want to go now to Nick Patton Walsh. He's live in Sana'a, Yemen. It's the home base for the terror group U.S. officials have consistently said is one of the most threatening to the U.S. homeland. That is Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and also the group that has a direct tie to the Paris attacks. Nick, what is the handle that Yemeni authorities have there? Fact is, isn't it, that they've been losing ground against AQAP in recent months rather than gaining?
Well, actually, the country's been in such turmoil generally for the past few years. That's what's enabled AQAP to have the foothold they had here for years. The most recent developments in the past few months actually involve a predominantly Shia movement here, militia tribesmen called the Houthis, who've swept into the capital Sana'a behind me. Now, that has caused significant upheaval. They said they detained other people use the word kidnapped the presidential chief of staff just yesterday in the city centre itself. Obviously an escalation in that war there. But Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, one diplomat told me, are in fact find themselves benefiting strangely furthermore from this upheaval, because some Sunnis concerned with what they see as the Shia advance here, the Houthis advance, are actually taking up arms and effectively making the local ground battle for Al-Qaeda, a Sunni group, slightly easier because they have more men in numbers, allowing them to focus on external operations. So frankly, no matter how bad it gets here in Yemen, that always seems somehow to benefit Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. They claimed that operation against the Charlie Hebdo magazine, that was the name that was shouted by the Cauchy brothers during those attacks. The only thing investigators have to piece together now, Jim, is exactly what level of reality that corresponds to. How much of a real logistical and support link and command link was there between militants here in Yemen and the brothers, and did that sustain up until the moments before the attacks themselves, Jim?
Nick, is there...
Yeah, and that's a detail that wasn't really covered in a lot of the claims that I showed earlier that people should be skeptical about, that just because Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula has claimed credit for the Kouachi brothers and ISIS has claimed credit for the Ahmed Kolabali who took over the kosher delicatessen, that doesn't mean that they were actually directed, although I'm not sure exactly how that's going to turn out. That's one of the facts that remain to be seen, and I guess we'll be covering that hopefully in future shows, find out more about what happened in Paris as that investigation continues, and that, you know, missing woman and other members of the cell, if they exist, and who knows. But I want to quickly show one more clip from CNN's State of the Union where they covered the topic of the Ukraine, which has kind of fallen off the radar of the corporate media. One thing I agree with Rush Limbaugh I'd mentioned before is that the mainstream media, the corporate media, could be accurately referred to as the drive-by media, because they look at some topics and they drive by and then it falls off their radar and you don't hear about it. But things are still going on in the Ukraine, which I credit CNN State of the Union for covering, with Jim Sciutto asking a question of Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut, the Democrat, including some drone footage over Donetsk in the Ukraine that was kind of interesting in this clip.
As well. I want to ask you about Ukraine now, because there is, when you look at the evidence on the ground, a low-level war underway in Eastern Europe. And I just want, for the sake of our viewers, show some drone video over Donetsk in eastern Ukraine, which, when you see this area from the air, and I've been to this airport in Donetsk before just a number of months ago, this looks like a war zone, and the deaths on the ground and the Russian troops on the ground indicate a war is underway there. The administration's position has been that economic sanctions will lead to de-escalation. Meanwhile, on the ground, Senator Murphy, we're seeing escalation in recent weeks. Is the Obama administration policy failing with regards to Russia and Ukraine?
Well, listen, ultimately, the United States is not going to fight a proxy war against Russia inside eastern Ukraine. And so long as the United States is not fighting that war, the Ukrainian army, which has been undermined over the last 10 years by corrupt generals, is going to be at a disadvantage against an invading Russian army or Russian-supported army. But I have come to the point where I believe now that the United States needs to start sending more significant military assistance to the Ukrainians. That was not a position I held initially in this debate, and I've been pressing the administration to support that view. Right now, economic sanctions are not, in the short run, convincing Russia to pull back. You've seen some significant improvements in terms of central governance out of Kyiv with the new President Poroshenko taking the reins of government. But I think the administration has to start looking at some more serious levels of defensive armaments being sent to the Ukrainians. I think that would help in a fight that we have to admit is not ending anytime soon.
So the Ukraine conflict is ongoing, and Democratic Senator Chris Murphy is joining some of the more hawkish Republicans and advocating for more direct military aid to the Ukrainian government to fight the Russian-backed proxy in eastern Ukraine. And the Russian economy has had a lot of problems, but I guess that doesn't necessarily make them less dangerous. It might make them more dangerous. Maybe it will come back onto the radar of more of the shows than just that one question on CNN's State of the Union. And speaking of State of the Union, the President's State of the Union address is coming up on Tuesday, and I want to show 4 quick clips on that before I end the show. First, from Real Time's Overtime, Bill Maher answered a question about it, and this is the more optimistic look at the Obama presidency, I guess, and there's a clip from actor-comedian Josh Gad in there, and also Wes Moore makes a comment, and I'll talk about that a little more after you see it here.
Does President Obama deserve to brag a bit in his upcoming State of the Union speech? Yes, but he won't. Right? He won't. It's just not in his genes.
He's been on fire lately. I love that every week he's got another new mandate.
He's a bit liberated by being a lame duck, right?
He's been liberated.
He flipped the script on lame duckism. Yeah. He's like, you know what? You want a fucking lame duck? I'll show you lame.
and I tell you what, I think that's why there will be some bragging in this one, because what he needs now more than anything else is momentum. Right. He needs to show people, I am not a lame duck. Let me show you exactly what's going on in this country. Let me show you the momentum we have. And by the way, you ain't seen nothing yet, because we got 2 more years. So actually, I expect there will be quite a bit of bragging to let the country know that we just started.
All right, we will end on that.
So that's the more optimistic view over on HBO, but now I'm going to show you a few quick clips from NBC, ABC, and CBS that are not quite as optimistic about what President Obama is going to get done compared to what he's proposing, which are summarized pretty well in a couple of these clips, starting with NBC's Meet the Press, Chuck Todd asking a question of the senior advisor to the president, Dan Pfieffer, over in this clip.
Coming up on Tuesday is President Obama's second to last State of the Union speech, and last night we learned that the president will call on Congress to raise taxes on the wealthy in order to pay for some tax cuts for the middle class. And he would do that by raising the top capital gains rate to 28%, which would hit the wealthiest Americans. Last night, the White House also announced plans that they want to close what's called the trust fund tax loophole. That also would hit those who, of course, are better off. Earlier in the week, the president unveiled plans for free community college tuition and paid sick leave. He's pressuring Congress to do that. And of course, people were wondering, how is he going to pay for it? Well, now we have the answer. I'm joined now by Dan Pfieffer, senior advisor to the president.
Thanks.
Welcome back here. Let me start with taxes here. Forms of this tax proposal to pay for things that you want to do for the middle class, you've done for 5 years in some form or another, trying to target wealthiest Americans in various ways, raising deduction. It didn't get through when you had a Democratic Congress. It didn't get through when you had a Democratic Senate. Why do you think a tax hike on the wealthy is going to get through a Republican Congress?
Well, because we're in a place now, Chuck, where we have come back from the crisis, where the American economy is in its best place that it's been in a long time. So the question is, what do we do now to deal with the decades-long trends of wage stagnation, declining economic mobility? So the president's put forward a series of investments and tax relief for the middle class, paid for by a very simple idea, which is the wealthy, the largest financial institutions and corporations should pay a little more. Some of these ideas have Republican support. The fee on financial institutions is an idea very similar to one in Republican Congressman Dave Camp's tax plan last year. So we're going to make a case for it. We're going to see what we're going to do. And if Republicans want to oppose closing the trust fund loophole, let them make their case to the country.
But again,
now the next couple clips are going to be Republicans who are making their case, and they don't sound that cooperative. First, over on ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos, Martha Raddatz posed a kind of similar question to Republican Adam Kinzinger, and he just responded by saying the Obama administration never reaches out, never has met me personally. Over in this clip.
The State of the Union, we've already gotten a big preview on what may be upcoming. The State of the Union proposals, these policy proposals, free community college for 2 years, paid sick and maternity leave, expanded internet access, and a tax hike on the wealthy to pay for a middle-class tax cut. Any of these going to happen?
We tried this tax hike on the wealthy thing with the fiscal cliff, which I voted for, by the way, because to me it represented compromise, which is necessary. This will be my 5th State of the Union with President Obama. I've heard so many proposals, some of which sound good, some that don't. And every time after the State of the Union, and I try to be this ever optimist, but every time after the State of the Union, he goes and retreats and doesn't reach out to Congress. I've met the president probably 2 or 3 times in my entire life, and each were at a receiving line. He's never reached out to Congress, and Democrats tell you the same thing. You can't get your proposals done unless you're willing to have a relationship with an important branch.
And it's a two-way street.
Now, I've heard that criticism of the Obama administration from a lot of pundits, but it does seem a little petulant. He didn't reach out. That seems like a bad way to decide the governing outcomes in our system, constitutional system. But the last clip I want to show is this is Senator Marco Rubio, who definitely sounds like he's running for president, answering a similar question from Bob Schieffer over on CBS's Face the Nation about, what's your response to President Obama's proposal to cut taxes or to increase taxes on the rich and cut taxes for the middle class over here.
We are also learning that in his State of the Union address, the president is going to propose, I'm told, $320 billion in new taxes on the wealthy, also $235 billion in new spending. Some of that will go to his proposal to offer free community college educations to everyone. Your take on that?
Well, I actually came out with a book this week called American Dreams, and in that book I talk about this. This is a 20th century outdated model that the president is following. The notion, first of all, that in order for some people to do better, someone has to do worse, is just not true. Raising taxes on people that are successful is not going to make people that are struggling more successful. The good news about free enterprise is that everyone can succeed without punishing anyone. It would also be counterproductive. But here's my bigger point. I'm all for reforming our higher education system. In the 21st century, to have the skills you need for a middle-class job, you need higher education of some form or fashion. It may not be a 4-year degree. The problem is he just wants to pour that additional money into the broken existing system, which a lot of people will graduate with AA degrees that don't lead to anything but another 4-year degree that may not lead to a job. What we need to do is create competition with alternative methods where people can acquire certification programs that take less than 2 years and get you to work right away as a welder, an electrician, an airplane mechanic. I wish he would spend more time on that and less time trying to raise taxes and pour money into an outdated model that no longer works in the 21st century.
Now, a lot of what Marco Rubio was talking about there, if you read between the lines, sounds kind of like he's talking about those for-profit colleges. A lot of Republicans support those where they get government aid and people don't actually graduate and they scam people. And I've talked about that on some previous episodes of this program. But that's the last clip that I have to show you. I do appreciate, I think I had around 120 people who watched live, so I appreciate that. I did read your comments along the way of a few that I picked out. Let's see, the first one I noticed that I wanted to answer real quickly for you. This comes from Lady Grace 2, was asking if you don't want to do the Patreon thing, is there any other way to donate? Although I can't put a link in the corner here or the corner here, at least until the end of the quarter, according to YouTube, I might be able to do that. If you go to my channel page, youtube.com/LiberalViewer, there is a support Liberal Viewer link there that you can click on and donate money directly. if you live in one of 4 countries, I believe the countries are the United States, Mexico, Japan, and Australia. So if you live in one of those 4 countries and you want to donate money directly to support my channel, there's a link over at youtube.com/liberalviewer. Otherwise, you have to do Patreon, and all, which I mentioned earlier. Second comment I wanted to respond to. Jemay Le Renard, I guess, isn't that mean I love foxes, says, no, Boko is not a threat to the world. Well, thank you. I did ask you to tell me in the comment section if you thought that Boko Haram was actually a threat to the world, because I was sort of incredulous about that. So at least one person agreed with me on that. And then the final comment I picked out with a screen capture. This is from Simiols, pointed out something I should have. This is a good comment. This is a criticism of Mike Huckabee I hadn't thought of. Mike Huckabee is a hypocrite. He needs to go and have a read of his friend Ted Nugent's lyrics. And that's true. It's kind of like what Bill Maher said in that other clip about how, you know, free speech is for like just the people on your side, and then you're always going to find the thing you don't like is the exception to free speech. And Ted Nugent is definitely a Fox News regular and right-wing regular that probably is a friend of Mike Huckabee's. I don't know that for sure, but good comment from, I think that's Simiols. Is that how you pronounce that? And that's the end of the show. I hope you enjoyed the clips I picked out for you. I appreciate those of you who joined me live. If you're watching this as a recorded show, hopefully I'll put in those topic indexes, time indexes for the topics for you. Also, like I said, look for my upcoming video, Sam Harris Defamed as Islamophobic by Glenn Greenwald, Reza Islam, that I've been promising for so long. If you want to support me on Patreon and be a patron, I'll put that up, a draft of that for my patrons to comment on Tuesday, and then the final version for the public will be available Thursday, probably before noon Pacific time. Other than that, you can join me every Sunday at 6:30 p.m. Pacific time for my Sunday clip roundup. Hopefully it leaves you more informed to end your weekend, begin your week, whenever it is you're watching it, and I'll be seeing you all around the internet.